and nature, how to protect the environment during armed conflicts, or how to protect the environment. It's organized by the Executive Certificate Program in Nature Positive Economy of the Executive Education Program of the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Romina Pesot, a researcher in international law at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and today I will be moderating this webinar. I would like to mention that during this webinar about the structure, we will have 2 rounds of questions, during which each speaker will have 5 minutes to answer the questions, and then we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. So I invite you and I encourage you to write your questions in the meantime in the Q&A box that you will see there in our screen. And of course, we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Gilles Carbonnier. He's professor of development economics at the Geneva Graduate Institute and also academic advisor at the Executive Certificate Program in Nature Positive Economy. Welcome, Gilles. Our second speaker is Helen Obregón Gieseken. She is a legal advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross here in Geneva, and also she is the co-author of the ICRC's updated guidelines on the protection of the environment during armed conflicts. Welcome, Helen. And our last speaker with us today is Weir. He is the director at the Conflict and Environment Observatory in the UK. Welcome, Doug. So let's start with our conversation. I think that the title of this webinar illustrates the tension that exists between conflict and nature. And this tension is inevitable because we know that destruction and damage are part or inherent of armed conflicts. Besides, current armed conflicts are taking place during a triple planetary crisis due to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. However, the question that we should ask is how long and how much damage the environment can continue sustaining. So I would like to start with a simple question for our speakers, just to think about and brainstorm between us about which are those legal issues, environmental consequences, and environmental causes that are not getting the attention that they deserve by the international community, and which could be maybe the long-term consequences of this denial or lack of attention. So I don't know if maybe Doug, would you like to be the icebreaker and start answering? How do you feel about it?
Thanks, Romina. Yeah, I'm happy to take that one on. So I guess just maybe stepping back a little bit from the question, I think we've moved quite a long way, quite quickly in terms of the degree of attention and engagement we're giving to the environment in relation to armed conflicts. So not just damage during, but also how the environment is impacted by militarism before conflicts, and then how the environment is addressed and engaged with post-conflict and in the transition from conflict to peace. It's very different, and one of the, I guess, main drivers of that is the amount of data which we have, and if we have data, that means that can then inform policy. And where previously we were very reliant on post-conflict assessments, we're now much more able to track environmental change in near real time through better access to satellite imagery, through open source intelligence, in much the same pattern which we see with human rights violations and other issues during conflict. We have more access to more data, and that then has a tangible impact on policy and response. I guess that's all very positive, but I think at the same time, we still see that this issue is not getting enough attention in most cases, and you have these struggles for prioritization. Inevitably, when we focus on conflicts, we focus on the direct human impacts. But actually, we have to understand that the human impacts and environmental impacts are very much 2 sides of the same coin, right? We need a healthy, clean environment for food, for drink, to breathe, and that we can't really see these 2 issues in isolation in a way which perhaps has been done so in the past. Interestingly, we've seen some new developments in relation to sort of contemporary conflicts. So much of our work focuses on Ukraine, but also on Sudan. 2 very different contexts, certainly in terms of the degree of attention the environment is receiving. I think in the question of Ukraine, we have seen this unprecedented degree of attention on the environmental dimensions of the conflict, and that's both in terms of direct impacts, physical damage, damage to habitats, damage to landscapes, pollution incidents, and also some of the indirect impacts as well, which might be transboundary in nature, which might be anything from having to reroute flights away from Russia and what's the carbon consequences of that. On the carbon consequences themselves, it's the first time anybody has tried to track the greenhouse gas emissions of any conflict ever, which has required the creation of a whole new methodology to do so. And so there is this degree of attention, and that's societal interest, it's about media interest, it's about advocacy on behalf of the Ukrainian government, which has really driven the environment up the agenda. And that has having consequences in terms of what the response is looking like. So we have seen this launch of a green recovery platform for Ukraine. And again, this is a novel initiative for a conflict, but reflects the times we're in. When we look in contrast to Sudan, the environment has a much lower public profile and media profile, and that will have consequences for Sudan in the future. And it's particularly problematic for Sudan because its environment and resources have been profoundly linked to conflict historically. At the moment, we see a lot of interest in oil, in gold, these outside interests pushing these high-value natural resources in Sudan. We have also historically seen disputes over land, over water. And so unless we address the environment effectively in relation to Sudan, then there are problems in terms of Sudan's peace. So there's this disparity of attention which we see between conflicts and between the environment. And similarly, I think, just briefly, we still focus very much on the direct impacts of conflict, the kind of photogenic incidents, big things on fire, physical damage. And actually, there's a lot less attention on the implications of the collapse of environmental governance, from demographic changes, from new economies which may emerge, from coping strategies of populations, such as deforestation, from the spread of small arms and light weapons, which can be used for hunting, and also in changes in the management and resource sharing systems in countries as well. So many of these can have substantial impacts on the environment and on nature and species and habitats. So just as one example of spread of small arms and light weapons, in Libya, with the fall of Gaddafi, many weapons caches were blown open, and these weapons found themselves to East Africa, where they were used for poaching elephants. So it's this idea that these environmental impacts are not necessarily localized. They can be spread far beyond the boundaries of the conflict, and they can move in quite indirect ways through the environment. I will probably leave it there before I go on for too long.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, I know it's a passionate topic, but thanks a lot for doing this summary about this disparity of attention between the conflicts and how this impact the decision-making for improving the situation. I think that you summarized it really nice. So, Gilles, would you like to share with us your thoughts about the environmental causes of armed conflicts?
Yes, Romina, thank you. And just to follow up on Doug, who looked a bit more at the consequences of armed conflict on nature, I'd like maybe to uncover and discuss a bit the role of natural resources in triggering conflict, be it natural resource abundance or scarcity, and to look at what research tells us about it. And second, I'd like to look a bit more at the looming challenges that we are witnessing today with this rush on strategic minerals to power the energy transition. So if we look at the past, we have seen two previous global scrambles for natural resources. The first one was, early industrial powers intensifying their colonial enterprise to control resource-rich territories, trade. And as we know, this episode has been extremely violent. The Cold War gave rise maybe to a second global scramble, whereby the East and the West were competing to secure allegiances from newly independent, resource-rich developing countries. And this often prompted also proxy wars, that is, civil wars in resource-rich developing countries, where parties to the armed conflict are supported by opposing big powers. Now, today, we witness a third great scramble for natural resources, and this time it's to sustain digital transformation, the energy transition, and the shift towards a greener economy. And 10 years ago, who was discussing about cobalt, lithium, rare earth? Today, it's the discussion of the day. So these strategic minerals have become a big stake. And next, I think the intensification of mining activities has, of course, a dire impact on nature, with widespread deforestation, biodiversity loss, water pollution, and soil erosion. And host communities are also reacting, sometimes violently, with the risk of conflict because of this environmental impact. Now, in the context of big power rivalry, we see a trend toward renewed resource nationalism, which involves export restrictions or export bans. And the ensuing response is, of course, diplomatic efforts by others to secure critical supplies. And next to a rising risk of confrontation to control key resources and trading routes, we also possibly will see a renewed risk of proxy wars that may plague resource-rich developing countries. Maybe in the second part, in your second question, I will address what can be done to minimize these risks and what have we learned from research in terms of preserving peace. Now, another risk derived from the degradation of the natural environment associated with both industrial mining and artisanal and small-scale mining. And it's a staggering number of small-scale artisanal miners, which may be anywhere between 40 and 50 million worldwide. And we see that host communities sometimes violently oppose mining projects if it harms the environment, and they don't see significant benefits in terms of economic fallouts, as we have seen, for instance, in Peru. And I think the stakes are particularly high nowadays for Africa, which holds well over a fifth of the strategic minerals, and we can just think of cobalt in the DRC as a case in point. Research shows that these countries that heavily depend on natural resource exports and that have relatively fragile governance systems, they face a higher risk of conflict. And this risk of conflict sometimes is not so big in resource scarce countries. And indeed, resource scarcity have often given rise to cooperative arrangements. This is, for instance, the case with water resources and managing river basins, where for the past 1,200 years, we have seen over 3,600 water treaties that have been concluded between parties. So it does not mean that we can discard the conflict risk related to river basins and water, because we have seen instances where states upstream have threatened to divert or cut down water flows downstream, but it shows that international cooperation can really help solve these tensions and the risk of conflict. So to conclude, Romina, I'd like to highlight just two issues that are crucial to avert that this rush on critical mineral causes yet more armed conflicts and wars. The first is to adopt governance and strengthen governance arrangements and policies to avoid that commodity-dependent states suffer from the resource curse. And maybe I'll come back to that in the second question on what to do to avert the resource curse. And the second, I think, is really to factor into the equation war economies. And we have just to look at four variables, important variables of war economies. First, how natural resources end up financing armed conflicts. And this is a well-known example, like oil and gas in the case of the Islamic State group in Syria, in Iraq, or rebels controlling coltan extraction and trades in the Great Lakes region. We must also consider the criminal economy that tend to flourish under legal impunity. And actually, sometimes the war economy is first fueled and developed to fund conflict, but it becomes self-perpetuating and the reason for the conflict, because those who benefit and make profits out of war oppose peace, as they have no economic and political incentives where they stand to lose. And maintaining conflicts helps to maintain legal impunity to continue into criminal activities. The third dimension is key, and especially for humanitarian organization, of course, is the survival economy. But this survival economy is often linked with the other dimensions of the world economy. Think of small-scale artisanal mining I referred to. It's a mainstay for hundreds of thousands of people in terms of livelihood, vulnerable people in conflict-prone area. You can think also of poppy production or coca production in other conflicts. And the last and the fourth dimension is, of course, the fact that world economies are intimately embedded within the globalized financial and trade systems. And this is where economic sanctions, embargoes, and so forth seek to influence world economies by curtailing these links between local world economic dynamics and global markets. So we just have to consider that these four dimensions are intimately imbricated, and there are no quick fixes. We have to understand the interaction as we seek to act on one or the other to reduce the risk of natural resources fueling conflict.
Right. Thank you, Gilles, for this snapshot about the different dimensions of the relationship between natural resources and conflicts. So, Helen, I would like to hear from you about your perspective from which are those legal issues that maybe are being overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romina, and the previous speakers. So also, maybe just backtracking a tiny bit to complement on some of the points that Doug and Gilles mentioned in terms of why this matters and what we see in armed conflicts today. I think one of the overlooked issues, and maybe where I will add, so that I don't repeat what was already said by previous speakers, is that in armed conflicts today, one of the things that we are seeing is how hostilities are embedded, as you said, Romina, at the very start, in the climate and environment crisis that we're seeing today. And an example of that is how in the past 50 years, natural ecosystems have declined by almost 50% on average, and around 25% of animal and plant species are close to extinction. And one of the drivers of all of this is conflict. So we see how wars themselves are deepening the crisis. This is from everything from attacks that directly target the natural environment, but also attacks that incidentally damage it, like, for example, when chemical and industrial facilities are targeted, and then that releases pollutants into land and soil. We also see how biodiverse areas are particularly affected when wars are waged in these. And of course, the impact of explosive weapons, which can remain, the toxic elements of that, which Doug mentioned, that can remain on the ground for years, if not decades. And of course, as Doug was also saying, this is dangerous because ecosystems and biodiversity are crucial for sustaining human life. So by failing to protect the environment, we fail to protect people. And the environment is increasingly fragile today with climate change considerations coming in. So while, as you said, Romina, damage to the environment in conflicts is in a way inherent, there are limits to this. And this is where I want to sort of come into what international law can do. So before zooming in on international humanitarian law, which is what I wanted to talk about today, just to mention, of course, the historic adoption by the International Law Commission of its principles on the protection of the environment in armed conflict in 2022. And these are important because they were adopted after 10 years of state consultations. And essentially what they do is they set out the normative framework that protects the environment before, during, and after armed conflicts. And one of the things that perhaps is overlooked, to zoom in on your question, Romina, is that we know, of course, that international environmental law protects the environment. We know there is climate law that seeks to address some of the consequences of climate change. And we know that there's also human rights law that, of course, protects the right to food and therefore the environment, among other rights. But sometimes the role of international humanitarian law is overlooked, or, as Doug said, not sufficiently taken into account by warring parties. So IHL, in other words, the law of armed conflict, which really seeks to regulate the behavior of militaries and parties to armed conflict, has a number of rules that limit environmental damage in war. So for example, no part of the environment can be attacked directly unless it becomes a military objective. Destruction of the environment is prohibited unless required by imperative military necessity. Any attack that causes disproportionate damage to the environment, also prohibited. And these are only some of the many rules that essentially form the basis of the international law that seeks to prevent damage and that can then be used for accountability of violations of this body of law. But obviously, this is the paper story. And in order for this to be effective, you need to implement it on the ground. You need it to be, integrated across domestic frameworks, but most importantly on the ground. And this is where the ICRC's guidelines that you mentioned at the beginning, Romina, come in, because what really the aim of this document that you see on the screen is essentially to facilitate for actors that are engaging in the application of international humanitarian law to facilitate its implementation, to facilitate understanding of the rules of international humanitarian law that protect the environment. So this is an update from a 1994 document, and it sets out 32 legal obligations and policy recommendations under international humanitarian law that protect the environment. And so essentially it's sort of a one-stop shop of relevant rules. And as you can see, they're available online, can be consulted in several languages. So I'll leave it at that for now for this first question.
Great, thanks, Helen. I think it was a good idea to remember the contribution of the UN International Law Commission with the PERAC principles and how that IHL is not alone. It has many allies within the other public international law branches. So that's, I think it's something that we should never forget, that IHL is not alone in the protection of the environment during armed conflicts. So I think that we have like a good summary or X-ray of the situation with this relationship between nature and conflict. And maybe we can switch to a more positive perspective. So now that we know what's going on, maybe we can also think about what are those collaborations or maybe also innovations or steps that can increase the protection of the environment, can improve it from your perspective, your experience, and also maybe from a regional perspective, something that can work and can imitate by other countries in other parts of the world. Helen, how do you feel about continue and answering this question first? Would you like to go ahead?
Sure, and I realize I didn't even take my PowerPoint off, so it's perfect.
No worries. You can switch it if you need it.
Sure, and thanks, Romina, for emphasizing the relevance of the other bodies of law, because indeed, I mean, it's a whole picture, and IHL is one part of it. So with that, we see that the law is there, that there is significant law that can be taken and used to enhance protection. And so the key really, and this is what the ICRC is really pushing for and emphasizing is, as I said, strengthening awareness of these rules, which can, and in order to implement them, basically to make them known among states and non-state armed groups in conflict. So to drive forward that implementation of the law, I'm just trying to advance. There are sort of 4 key recommendations that the ICRC is encouraging for states and parties to armed conflict, where we think change really needs to happen in the next years. The first of these is the more institutional one in terms of integrating these rules in domestic frameworks. So most importantly, in the armed forces doctrine, in their training, so that these are then applied on the ground, but also in legal frameworks, for instance, when it comes to the criminalization of environmental damage, right, which needs to be put into law at a national level for it to actually be effective. The second sort of big aspect of this, and it's quite an important one and connects with the point Doug was saying about data, is the assessment, basically the adoption and implementation of measures that allow us to assess the environmental impacts of wars before, but also regularly during military operations with the aim of minimizing these impacts. And of course, that requires information, which we now have much more of, and where environmental and civil society actors have a key role to play in helping us to take the information that we have in order to then use it to better implement the law. So in this recommendation, for example, some of the things that states can do is to appoint specialized staff within their armed forces to reduce the environmental impacts of wars, to seek advice from civilian agencies with environmental expertise and scientific knowledge, which of course, again, can be supplemented by open source data to assess, for instance, if an attack would cause disproportionate damage to the environment. And essentially, we really, to emphasize Doug's point, really need to harness the information that we now have to improve the conduct of hostilities in wars. Another action, governments should assess the environmental impacts of any new weapons that they are producing and plan to use. And still the importance of looking after battles at what the environmental impact was to then change behaviors going forward. A third area of recommendations is one that we've been encouraging at the ICRC for a long time, and it's basically for states to look at the areas that are particularly important from an environmental perspective or fragile, essentially to put them off limits to any military operations and to not place military objectives within these. And fourth and finally, but really important as well, the exchange of good practices. Because we see that there is really a range of good practices out there, but these need wider uptake. And this is why in 2023, the ICRC, together with Switzerland, organized a state expert meeting on IHL protecting the environment. And there were over 120 states present at that meeting. And the aim was really to share challenges, but also good practices on how states can actually implement their obligations to better protect the environment. And these are available on a chair's summary, as you see on the screen. So really, the message is there are good practices, but these vary significantly. Some states are less developed, and there's more we can do to make this good practice available, more understood and implemented across all states. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, for sharing these ideas about the importance of implementing rules, because otherwise they are only written, and without implementation we won't find any change to this. So in the meantime, I want to recall that the Q&A box is open, so feel free to make your questions that in a few minutes we will start answering them. But before that, let's continue answering and brainstorming with this question about those innovations, collaborations, ideas, etc., that can be implemented by states and why not by armed groups. So, Doug, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to focus on two kind of main areas which are kind of relevant to the work which we do a lot of the time, and where there are clear pathways towards progress. I guess also just want to touch on this again, return to this question of attention consistency between conflicts. I'm just reflecting on it further then. I think particularly when you have a topic which struggles for attention, like the environment, if you have a conflict which is struggling for media or public attention, then trying to get attention on that issue, which is then several processes removed, is particularly particularly challenging. I know this is a wider question for how we as society address particular conflicts and the degree of media or political attention in them, but just wanted to flag that it is potentially very problematic for ensuring that the environment is addressed. And just in terms of addressing the environment and picking up on what Helen was saying around data collection and understanding the nature of harm. So what we do need and what we don't have at the moment is clear standards for data collection, whether that is sampling in the field or remote monitoring, which is a lot of the work which we do. Last year, we worked with Ukraine at the 6th UN Environment Assembly on a resolution which essentially requested UNEP to set up a process to develop standardized guidance, which could be used by states, civil society, other stakeholders. And so finally, you would have some kind of clear rule book. At the moment, there is a huge amount of work being done. Often it's peacetime approaches. Sometimes those are great. In addition, there's lots of new technologies which are offering us new forms of data and new ways of understanding it. But to really kind of better understand environmental harm and conflict, we need to institutionalize this work in some way and do it in a more organized fashion. And this also has sort of values for capacity building for conflict affected states, for example. A lot of the times in many conflicts, national authorities don't have the capacity, don't have the expertise to be able to document harm. And this guidance would really help in those situations. Going on from data as well, and one of the sort of key lessons I think from Ukraine is around data collection, coordination. So Ukraine was data collection Wild West in many respects. You had a huge number of stakeholders engaging on the conflict and gathering data, whether it's international organizations, whether it's international or domestic NGOs, academia, local authorities, huge number of stakeholders. And what we also saw was quite a lot of duplication in terms of data collection. And while that might be one thing in Ukraine, where there were a lot of resources, a lot of capacity for data collection, somewhere like Sudan, where there are far fewer resources and far fewer stakeholders, that then becomes particularly problematic if resources are being wasted and duplicated. So we need greater coordination, potentially from a UN level, to organize who's collecting data and where and on what and how it can be used. It's very disorganized at the moment. And even between elements of the UN system, in fairness. So we need more thinking around that to make sure we get the best value for money and most impact from data collection. Building on that as well, looking at participatory data collection, how can we empower communities to gather environmental data? This brings incredible values around situated knowledge around the environment, and you can also link some of the remote data collection to local expertise and local ground truthing, for example. So those are some data collection prospects which could be advanced. Two other things are around environmental mainstreaming. So again, speak to this issue of consistency of attention. There has been a process around environmental mainstreaming in peace and security for some time. It is perhaps a decade behind gender. We need to reach that stage where the environment is not seen as a nice to have, but is recognized for the fact that it is essential. And different sectors are at different stages in this. The humanitarian sector are further ahead than the mine action sector, for example, who we work with. But we also need to think about how we mainstream peace and security questions in environmental agreements and environmental spaces. So there are many multilateral environmental agreements, and they are potential frameworks for ensuring that we should get more capacity and support to conflict-affected countries. And we also need to open up these spaces for discussions around this. So, for example, Ukraine have made huge steps in the last few years around opening up the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings to talk about impacts of conflict and peace and security, as have Palestine. And this is incredibly valuable because it's been an area which has been ignored for decades within climate talks. And it's interesting this week, Greta Thunberg and some Danish civil society colleagues were occupying the offices of Maersk Shipping, partly because an element of Maersk Shipping ships weapons to Israel. So increasingly, we're seeing this long overdue intersectional advocacy around climate, peace and security, which is, incredibly important, but an example of how we need to think about peace and security in environmental spaces and the environment in peace and security spaces. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Doug, for sharing this food for thought. I find it really interesting, this example about Ukraine, and also how to frame security and environment. It's something that we should still think about it. So, Gilles, would you like to share with us your thoughts about these questions that I make to you?
Yes, Romina, I think on what to do, to try to, provide for a more enabling environment for peace. I think, as you, Romina, and Helen mentioned, respect for international law and international humanitarian law in particular cannot be understated in its capital. And I think that this consensus must really serve as a starting point. Now, to come back to what I presented before on how to reduce the risk of armed conflict related to natural resources, I think that the first thing that can be done and is starting to be done is to simply try to reduce the demand for such strategic minerals by boosting recycling and by moving towards a more circular economy, towards a more regenerative economy where we use and reuse, recycle metals and minerals. And states can support policies that promote the design of products that are easy to disassemble in order to recover the metals and minerals that are embedded. And we can also see initiatives and technologies that help extract metals and minerals from urban wastes. And it's necessary to continue investing in R&D, I think, in these technologies and also in finding substitutes for those extractive activities that are most polluting and also most socially unacceptable. A second mitigation strategy is to reduce the risk of war over strategic minerals is, of course, the diversification of supply chains that reduce dependency over single suppliers and the risk of export bans. A third avenue, which is really worth exploring, is to build on successful multi-stakeholder governance mechanisms that brings together states, industry, and civil society. The Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative is a case in point. It has instilled greater transparency on payments made by companies to producer states. But yet our own research has shown that the financial markets do not yet reward states that are compliant with the initiative in terms of the rating of their sovereign debts and the interest they have to pay on debts, despite the increased transparency. So it is necessary to really involve also, I think, capital markets in this approach in terms of incentives. There are other initiatives such as the OECD due diligence process or the Kimberley process on conflict diamonds that also show that these multi-stakeholder endeavors can really be an effective way to deal with the risk. A fourth priority is to have mining firms in strengthening what is really genuine consultations with host communities when they seek prior informed consent for extraction and exploitation of nature. And I think this must translate in effective measures to protect the natural environment and also to ensure the fair sharing of benefits. And a fifth category of measures that I referred to before that, in my mind, deserve greater research and scrutiny is the use of economic sanction and embargoes, looking not only how they are successful in curtailing the financing of armed conflict, but also how they impact survival economies and the livelihood of the most vulnerable. For instance, the abrupt introduction of a conflict-free mineral law over a decade ago in major markets resulted in hundreds of thousands of miners being out of business from one day to another and losing a mainstay and main income sources. And what we see is that there are no quick fixes or quick fix solution to transition from a war economy towards a peace economy. This requires a more gradual formalization process, a diversification of the economy. And this does not happen in typical Weberian states, well-functioning Weberian states. This happens in hybrid political orders, where we see that there are competing centers of authority, of legitimacy, that shape the actual governance of natural resources on the ground. And this has to be taken into account. Finally, I mentioned in my first intervention the resource curves. And I think for the sake of time, I won't go into this phenomenon, which is so prevalent and difficult to counter in fragile settings. But suffice to say that this phenomenon involves very complex economic and political dynamics, but also socio-environmental reactions that all can concur to more armed conflicts. What research has shown is that there are powerful antidotes or remedies to this resource curse that can contribute to averting that this rush, the new rush or scramble on to get access to strategic metals and minerals, give rise to more wars. And since I don't have time to go into detail, let me just refer to what you mentioned, Romina. Indeed, in our executive education programs, we do address each of these issues in depth. And in particular, in our new program on nature positive economy, these are issues that we really will explore quite in depth. And I invite all the people participating in the webinar to look at the website. There are still a few seats available if you're interested to register for this new executive course on nature positive economy. So with that, I think I would leave it at this juncture and give it the floor back to you, Romina, and to see if there are questions from the audience.
Thank you, Gilles, for sharing with us this amazing issue behind natural resources and armed conflicts. So I think that we can move to the Q&A because time is always, we are always lacking of time. So we have the chance to exchange and connect with the audience. So I am having a look to our Q&A box, and we have here a question that is related with the impact on the environment. It says, can rising awareness really succeed in convincing world powers to reduce their impact on the environment? How is the process to succeed it? And there's another one that says, what accountability mechanisms are in place for warring countries that weaponize natural resources during conflicts, especially after signing treaties? And there's a new one that says, what opportunities exist at the national governance level, example Ukraine, of tackle environmental challenges during war? Maybe we can start with these three questions. You can feel free to answer from any perspective or any part of them. So I don't know who would like to start with any of them.
I'm happy to jump in on the awareness raising question.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess this was the reason which we launched CEOBS in the first place, to raise awareness and understanding and to take advantage of the new data collection opportunities which were out there. I think we have seen transformative change, I think, in terms of documentation, awareness and understanding of environmental harm and conflicts over the last decade. It's, I've been working in this space for 20 years, and it has been huge, the change that we have seen, and particularly around the immediacy of it as well. And having worked on policy processes, for example, the work of the International Law Commission, where we were able to engage with that process and bring data from our monitoring work into those legal conversations to then affect changes in policy, it is entirely possible. Similarly, when we worked at the UN Environment Assembly, the resolutions and the language which we are supporting and promoting, it is based on the experience we have had from monitoring change and identifying problematic issues which could be addressed or need to be addressed in that context. So I think you can have substantial impacts on policy change by awareness raising, by data collection. In fact, you can't without it. Will this convince world powers to reduce their impact on the environment? I think it's part of the solution. It's not all of the solution. And we can see from the world around us that it's not the whole solution, right? There are many other considerations that go into choice of military actions. But it's not necessarily a case of about informing or minimizing damage when it does occur. It's also about helping to address that damage post-conflict. So by gathering this data during conflicts, we can inform and prioritize remediation work post-conflict, and hopefully at some point we can also contribute that data to accountability mechanisms and processes. I'll get there.
Thanks, though. Anyone else would like to jump?
I can perhaps follow unless Gilles, you wanted to come in first.
Go ahead, and depending what you say, I will come in.
Okay. No, I guess I'll answer a combination of the questions related to what accountability mechanisms are there, how can we, you know, increase compliance with the law, is it actually complied with, and are there cases where IHL has been used to look at environmental damage? So maybe, yeah, just to say basically there are different. The starting point, of course, is that, you know, you often hear that international law is, that humanitarian law is at the vanishing point of international law. And we know that accountability, compliance with international law more generally is one of the difficult things. But there are different ways to enforce IHL and to seek compliance. One way, which I mentioned, is criminal responsibility, of course, and using the war crimes that we have to pursue environmental damage. So, for example, in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there is the war crime of prohibited widespread, long-term, and severe environmental damage. But there are also a range of other war crimes, like the war crime of pillage, that can come in to address the pillage of natural resources in armed conflict. And importantly here, the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is in the process of finalizing a new policy paper precisely to look at how the International Criminal Court can look at environmental damage more systematically and comprehensively in its work. So throughout, from the investigation of cases all the way through prosecution. Maybe, and at the national level, of course, that's also important. And here we've seen the special jurisprudence jurisdiction for peace in Colombia, who has, for example, looked at environmental damages in the context of wartime within its case law. Human rights courts are also important. As you may know, the UN General Assembly in 2022 adopted a resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So human rights courts and treaty bodies can also look at this. And of course, then we have law of state responsibility that can be looked at, but maybe a couple of real examples other than the one that I've mentioned. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has looked at several issues related to environmental damage. So for instance, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it awarded damages to the DRC for environmental damage based on humanitarian law rules related to occupation. So that's just an example, but of course there's much more that can and should be done. Thanks.
And maybe just to add on my side about the question on what can big powers and others do to tackle the environmental damages caused by war. Maybe one comment is mainly with regards to the fact that we have a large contamination related to explosive remnants of war. And this is the case, of course, especially with weapons such as cluster munition bombs, as well as anti-personnel mine. And what we see, which is quite concerning, is for the first time, a number of member states which are considering to withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty on banning anti-personnel mine, or also withdrawing from the Cluster Munition Convention. And I think that what we have seen is that even for a country like Croatia, they have announced that probably next year, at the end of the day, they will be able to clear lands of the last remaining mines that were, there for more than 3 decades. It's hugely costly to do so. And from a military perspective, military experts who have first-hand experience in contemporary wars recognize that it doesn't make sense from a strategic and military perspective. And the contamination of land is just huge. And it is, I think, necessary now to have global movements toward universalizing ratification of such treaties and not to have an erosion with states withdrawing from such fundamental treaties, not to mention the horrific humanitarian consequences of both anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions that kill and maim primarily civilians and especially children.
Thank you, Gilles. So while we wait more questions, because we still have maybe 4 more minutes for Q&A. So if someone else wants to share a concrete question, please go ahead. You can write it in the Q&A box. And Gilles, I was thinking about this issue of diversification of economy. This should be something to think about in long term, right? So is there maybe something practical related with the topic that can be done easily for a country that maybe is involved in an armed conflict?
Well, I think this is absolutely key, this question of diversification to help commodity-dependent countries to move up the value-added ladder. And what is interesting nowadays with this global competition among major powers to get access to the resources is that commodity-dependent countries can get better deals in a way, including deals that are not limited to the extraction of natural resources, but also to the infrastructure necessary to bring these resources to different ports, not only on the Indian Ocean, for instance, from Africa, but also towards the Atlantic, and to have these deals including investments. And I will give you one example, the Lobito Corridor project that has been funded and supported by especially North America and Europe to bring resources from the DRC and Zambia towards the Atlantic, embeds part of the deal, which is also to invest in having those countries able to produce parts of batteries locally, to have more refining capacities on the spot rather than to just sell the raw products, and also to possibly move up the ladder with the production of electric motorcycle or scooters and things like this, which will be necessary as we see the African population doubling and with also opportunities there. And I think that this has to be really brought to the fore with these opportunities, because it's the major vehicle through which possibly to avert yet another resource curse in this country.
Thank you, Gilles. So there are people asking about the Nature Positive Economy course. If you can search for information at the Graduate Institute webpage. So I encourage you to search the information that is already available there. So we have 5 minutes before ending our webinar. So I apologize that we cannot answer all the questions. I appreciate your understanding, but always we think that we have too much time, but then time passes fast. So let's just to start finishing our webinar for our speakers. Let's imagine that the genie of the lamp appears and it grants you a wish related with the protection of the environment. Which would be that wish for each of you, thinking about the improvement of the protection of the environment and something that perhaps you would like to see solved in the next years? I don't feel free to answer this question as you wish. So I won't assign who would like to start. So it's up to you. Don't be shy.
So maybe I will start. You know, I would say that for me, the first thing to do is to put the interest of the local communities first, because local communities live within their natural environment and they depend on a healthy natural environment for their livelihood, for their health, and overall for developing a fruitful, productive, and enjoyable life. So it's key. Now, as I mentioned before, it's easier said than done, because this interacts then with a lot of environmental, but also social, political, and economic dynamics. And what we try to do within our executive course on nature positive economy, for example, is to embrace complexity, but not making it too complicated. Because when it's too complicated, one may feel powerless. And actually, there's so much that can be done that we have to have a systemic approach to see where to, like acupuncture, where to plant needles that really activate systems change and have a greater impact, because there are a lot of individual initiatives that are extremely nice to have, but some of these initiatives can really contribute to these systemic changes that we need today, because the challenges ahead of us are just absolutely huge. And the changes we have to go through are as commensurate. And this is why I think it's the way to go, but always starting from factoring into the equation the lived realities of communities on the ground.
Great, thank you, Gilles. I hope your wish come true. And Helen and Doug, one wish, one practical wish in less than 1 minute.
After you.
Thanks. And I'll start with pessimism before optimism, but only for a second. So obviously, I mean, as we were saying, and the questions in the chat really show that there's interest in this. We know that, like the speed limit rule in the rules of the road, the fact that the law is not respected every day doesn't mean that it doesn't protect and that it isn't useful. At the same time, we see in armed conflicts today that there is shockingly insufficient respect for the law, and that has to be said. So what we at the ICRC would like to see much before 10 years is really, strong and sustained political commitment of states to enhance respect for international humanitarian law rules, including those that protect the environment. And so this is precisely the aim of the global initiative to galvanize political commitment to IHL, which the ICRC recently launched with 6 countries: Brazil, China, France, Jordan, Kazakhstan, and South Africa. And basically, we're encouraging all states to join. And over the next 2 years, the aim is really to develop, I'm very sorry about that, concrete and actionable recommendations that can help to ensure that IHL is better respected on the ground. So we really think that this tragic trend of non-respect for IHL can be reversed. It is a very important body of law, remains so, adapted to the realities of warfare, but there needs to be commitment to respecting it on the ground.
Thanks, Helen. Finger crossed that it will come true. And Doug?
I'll be very quick. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect. This is a question we are always asked when we speak. Where is the accountability? And 10 years' time, my dream would that we would have the data and evidentiary standards in place. We would have the legal vehicles and instruments in place, and we would have the political will in place to hold parties accountable for the environmental damage they cause in relation to armed conflicts.
Cool. Finger crossed too. Okay, so we are on time, 1 p.m. So thanks to all. A big shout out to our speakers, and also thanks to the audience, those who are on the other side of the screen, for joining us today. I hope that this webinar has been useful and inspiring on this topic. So please stay tuned for more webinars from the Executive Certificate Program, and we stay in touch. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.